This week, we have already looked at what marine protected areas are and the global context of MPAs. In this video, we will look more at the Canadian context of MPAs. The map on this slide shows the marine protected areas in Canada. Currently, about 14% of Canada's ocean estate is protected, and the federal government was successful in meeting its 2020 target of 10% protection from the Convention on Biological Diversity's IG Target 11. Most of this protection has come since 2015 after the election of a Liberal majority government and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as at the time of the election, less than 1% of Canada's ocean territory was protected. When you look at this map, what sticks out to you? Where are most of our MPAs, and why do you think this is the case? Something else that should stick out to you is the amount of MPAs in Canada that are OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures. We discussed the difference between a protected area and an OECM in the first video this week, but I also mentioned that OECMs in Canada, specifically in the marine environment, differ from the IUCN standards that we looked at in that video. We will dive a bit deeper into these differences later on in this video. In Canada, there are a number of different types of marine protected areas which are managed and governed by different agencies and legislation, and each with different key goals and objectives. While they are all important and all have the potential to work towards marine biodiversity conservation in Canada, today we will focus our attention just on marine protected areas and marine refuge OECMs. Marine protected areas are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans through the Oceans Act. MPAs are designated for the conservation and protection of one of the following things: commercial and non-commercial fishery resources, including marine mammals and their habitats, endangered or threatened marine species and their habitats, unique habitats, marine areas of high biodiversity or biological productivity, or any other marine resource or habitat as is necessary to fulfill the mandate of the minister or for the purpose of maintaining ecological integrity. These marine protected areas cover about 6% of Canada's ocean territory, or a bit under half of the total marine protected area. Marine refuge OECMs are also under the jurisdiction of DFO, but are established and governed through the Fisheries Act. They are established to conserve and protect fish and fish habitat to manage fisheries, among other purposes. These OECMs cover just under 5% of Canada's ocean territory, or a little less than a third of the total marine protected area. If we think back to those 5 key features of a successful MPA that were identified by Dr. Edgar and his colleagues, the Neoli factors, how does Canada compare? In Canada, very few MPAs are completely no-take areas. Most of them allow for some kind of industrial-scale fishing activity, and a number of them also allow for oil and gas exploration within their borders. This is compounded by the fact that the very few no-take areas that do exist are poorly enforced, and many MPAs in Canada do not have a management plan. Though in part this is a factor of the age of Canada's MPA system, as most of them are less than 10 years old, and in fact the bulk of Canadian MPAs were actually only established in 2017. Most of the MPAs in Canada are also small, and they tend to be coastal and not overly isolated from fished areas, which of course makes the enforcement aspect tougher. Because of these factors, many have raised questions about the effectiveness of the Canadian Marine Protected Areas system, mainly related to the use of OECMs in the marine environment by the Canadian federal government. The establishment of marine protected areas in Canada got off to a slow start, and by 2015, only about 1% of the country's ocean territory was protected. However, following the 2015 election, the federal government, now under the leadership of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, oversaw the largest and most rapid increase in declared protected area in the history of the country, with nearly 5% of our marine area protected literally overnight in 2017. While this move got the country more than halfway to its 2020 10% target, it has been criticized by many in the conservation community because it was largely accomplished using OECMs. Of course, OECMs are not inherently a bad thing, and they can be a great tool to have in the conservation toolbox, but there are questions as to how effective the OECMs in this case are. This was because the standards as to what constitutes an OECM by DFO were not the same as the standards outlined by the IUCN that we saw in a previous video. They were also not in line with the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas, which largely adopted the IUCN guidelines. A comparison between the two standards for an OECM are outlined in this chart here. In part, this discrepancy was a factor of the timing around the development of the IUCN standards for OECMs. Remember that although OECMs were included as being eligible to count towards Aichi Target 11, there was no formal definition of what exactly counts as an OECM added to the Convention on Biological Diversity at that time. The IUCN established a task force in 2015 to define an OECM, and eventually released the criteria that we looked at in an earlier video in 2018. As a reminder, the definition developed was essentially the same as the IUCN definition for a protected area, but with one key difference. While protected areas must have conservation as their primary objective, an OECM can be managed with conservation as its secondary objective. While the IUCN group was working this out, DFO developed their own criteria for an OECM. The result is that DFO uses 5 criteria to identify OECMs: a clearly defined geographical location, conservation or stock management objectives, presence of ecological components of interest, long-term duration of implementation, and the ecological components of interest are effectively conserved. While some of these criteria are in alignment with the IUCN and CCEA standards, others have raised concern within the Canadian conservation community. Specifically, there is concern over the 2nd and 5th criteria, as arguments have been made that managing fish stocks is not akin to biodiversity conservation, because the motives are socioeconomic and have the potential to be in conflict with conservation objectives. The 5th criteria, that ecological components of interest are effectively conserved, has also raised red flags for its ambiguous wording, as it allows for a particular species to be focused on, rather than biodiversity conservation more broadly, which is the intent behind the IUCN guidelines and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In 2017, DFO used their criteria for an OECM to reclassify 51 fisheries closures as marine refuge OECMs. Together, these 51 areas represent about 5% of Canada's marine territory. The issue here is that fisheries closures are focused on protecting socioeconomic interests by hopefully supporting the regeneration of depleted stocks of commercially important fish species. Furthermore, they do not protect biodiversity from other activities such as shipping, oil and gas exploration, seafloor mining, and industrial fishing of species not deemed to be part of the closure. In other words, biodiversity conservation is not really a key priority. This reclassification resulted in a 5-fold increase in the marine area counting towards the government's protected areas target virtually overnight. It also meant that the federal government hit their 10% Aichi conservation target, but the heavy use of OECMs and the permitting of commercial fishing and oil and gas operations in marine protected areas has led several scholars and NGOs to express concern about the quality of the protected area. They point out that just 0.11% of Canada's ocean territory is fully protected from extractive uses, despite the fact that on paper, nearly 14% of the area is reported as protected. This has also led to concerns being raised about how the government may work towards achieving its next marine protected areas target, 30% by 2030, and questions as to whether the focus around protected areas is on quantity or quality. This over-reliance on OECMs and the perceived focus on quantity rather than quality is what led Chris Lemieux and Paul Gray to make the hamburger manufactured analogy in our reading, in reference to a 2004 U.S. presidential report where fast food jobs were classified as manufacturing in order to spin the narrative that the country was coming out of the recession and the jobs were coming back to the U.S. The key point is that definitions matter, and that sometimes seemingly subtle differences can have big impacts. So, how do we move forward and work towards a better outcome with the 2030 Marine Protected Areas targets? Our reading by Chris Lemieux and Paul Gray outlined 3 key ways forward. First and foremost, we need to measure the effectiveness of marine protected areas based on biodiversity outcomes rather than their spatial extent. Additionally, corridors for connectivity and buffer zones around industrial activity need to be considered. Second, the weak conservation objectives of all federal acts that involve MPAs need to be resolved. In other words, changes to the National Marine Conservation Areas Act, Canada Wildlife Act, Migratory Birds Convention Act, and the Fisheries Act are all needed in order to ensure that industrial activities are not permitted in protected areas and that biodiversity is a clear objective. Building on this legislative reform is the notion that a single agency should be established to have authority over and responsibility for MPAs, rather than the hodgepodge of jurisdictional responsibility that we have now. Lemieux and Gray also stress that because of its dual mandate to protect commercial fisheries and biodiversity conservation, DFO is probably not the organization to take this on. Finally, they note that Indigenous peoples have not been worked with to develop Indigenous protected areas for the marine environment. They point to a number of lessons that have been learned in the terrestrial environment around IPCAs, which we looked at earlier in this course, and that could provide a foundation for these types of conversations in the marine environment. Specifically, they single out the ongoing process for an establishment of a network of MPAs in the Northern Shelf bioregion on the Pacific Coast as an initiative that is working to strengthen marine conservation through the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the planning process. We will hear from the folks working on this initiative in our next video.